Hello and welcome to Lightways at Life Astrologer with me, Anna Isabel. And it is with great pleasure that I welcome back Juliet Sharman-Burke. Hello.
Hello, hello. Nice to be here.
It's always a delight to talk to you. And this time we are talking about another one of your collaborations with Liz Greene called The Mythic Journey, The Meaning of Myth as a Guide to Life.
Mm.
And I can't tell you how excited I was when I saw that title. Um, and when Margaret from the Wessex Astrologer first sent me the book, because from the earliest age, I have loved stories. And I have always known that there was something healing about them. And of course, growing up, it became more obvious. And then comes astrology. And here's my love of story, which incidentally, one of the first things I ever did as a job was I was a storyteller. So so that's why I was so excited to see this book. And I love the fact that it's the meaning of myth as a guide to life. So how did you and Liz Greene come to decide that this was an important book to do?
Good question. Well, we had already worked together on the Mythic Tarot, where we did a tarot deck and book which used myths to try to elucidate the meanings of the tarot cards. And as we were going through the process of talking about all the various myths that we could line up to match up with the tarot cards, we were just talking generally about how important myths are and how relevant they are. And I'd heard or read somewhere that I think it was a Hindu custom that when you went to the doctor and told them what was wrong with you, particularly for mental, anxieties, mental problems, they would prescribe a story, a myth, a fairy story, or a tale that you should go home and think about, which would help bring light to your particular trouble. And I just thought this was a wonderful idea that I just really appealed to me. And I said, I bet it would be really nice to and then Bruno Bettelheim did an amazing story called The Uses of Enchantment, which is unpacking children's stories for it's the meanings of Cinderella, the meanings of the Frog Prince, the meanings of all different sort of stories. Quite a Freudian interpretation, but nevertheless a very, very interesting understanding of the fairy tales. And I said, well, it would be lovely to do a mythic book, wouldn't it? Well, we agreed it together. And so we just started and we thought, well, it would be nice to put them in categories. So we've got childhood or parenting, myths about parents, myths about families, family dynamics, and then siblings, and then finding your vocation in life, the individuation process, and relationships and marriage, and finding a vocation. So we literally did a sort of a beginning to end, ending with death, and the end of life. So it was sort of like a myth for every stage of one's life. So there are some for power and ambition, and really a myth for every occasion.
Myth, of course, is at the heart of astrology.
Hmm.
And I think it is the reason for the enduring power of astrology. It's because the stories in it are meaningful now as they have always been.
Mm.
So I think it's huge to revisit these old myths. And the power of them is also the healing side, as you said, you know, when you've heard about this wonderful Hindu custom. And the very first talk I ever gave for the Astrological Lodge of London for a healing seminar was precisely about storytelling and the power of storytelling in healing. So it's very clear that there's something here, and I'm sure that you have, in the course of your work with clients, told stories, as I have done.
Very much so. Very much so.
What is your experience when you tell a story to a client? What happens?
Well, I think when you start to tell a story, suddenly attention shifts from ordinary, everyday. You go into a sort of a different space. And it's the same with clients. When you find the right story for the particular problem, if you like, or the particular issue that they're dealing with, you can see that there's some sort of recognition and some sort of resonance that happens. And then, you know, they'll talk about it afterwards. They'll say, well, of course, that's and sometimes the story gets repeated, or, you know, we keep on working on the same theme because, you know, the theme keeps running. And I also noticed that when teaching tarot, teaching astrology, you know, in a class, when the myth had to be, you know, the first thing was, well, the story is, this is the myth, and you start to tell the story and everything goes quiet and everybody is completely absorbed. Whereas if you start sort of saying, and the meaning of, you know, Aries is, you know, you give all the keywords or whatever, if you're teaching astrology, for instance, and you give a load of keywords, everybody just starts nodding off. But when you tell a story, everybody's awake and everybody's engaged. It's quite magical.
Completely. And it's true. I think there are so many difficult issues that crop up in a conversation with a client. And this is such a simple, non-threatening way to address issues. And I listen to a client, and then a story comes into my head, and I say, you know, there's a story here. And I tell the story, and I might ask, why do you think I thought of that story? And it makes them consider their own situation, and then perhaps see it in a different light. Because I think there's something about engaging the imagination. It's the non-linear part of the brain that then stimulates the ability to make connections and see things you couldn't see before.
Yeah, I agree. I think it really is quite, it's a different way of thinking. And I think it's you know, the stories that we chose for the book all had a particular, they were all particularly chosen for a particular phase in life, you know, like adolescence or leaving home, or and some of them are biblical and some of them are Greek and some of them are from North America, and there's a East African story and a Maori story in there, and they've all got a sort of a complete message. So you sort of, you know, it gives you something to kind of work on and think about if you're, I suppose, if you're that way inclined. And I think most people are, actually, if they're given a chance. I think this is one of the things, I guess this was another thing I discussed with Liz about, was how sad it is that the that myths and fairy tales and so on are not taught in schools in the way that they used to be. They are sometimes, but certainly not as a psychological, with any kind of psychological underlay. But we start telling a story to children, and they absolutely love it. They want the same. My granddaughter particularly absolutely loves the Greek myths, and she'll say, "Tell me a goddess story," or "Tell me the story about the Phaeton who fell from the sun chariot," or "Tell me about Ariadne who had a competition with Athena," and all of these stories, because they've all got some relevance. And you can see the themes that she's struggling with when she asks for a particular story.
Yes, and I think that this is a very important part of our roots, should be addressed. I have very fond memories of Aesop's fables.
Yes.
As a child as well.
Yes.
So do you have a favorite in the book?
That's a really good question, because I like all of them. There's a couple, actually, funnily enough, there's a couple of Arthurian stories that I really quite like. And one of them is Arthur's peacetime army. I don't know if you remember, if you got as far as that one, but there was a story, part of the mythology of King Arthur, that when he righted all the wrongs and slew all the dragons and, rescued all the damsons, there was nothing much to do. And his knights were sort of hanging about, getting a bit bored, and then they started being troublesome and drinking too much and being a bit aggressive, and it was quite problematic. And he said, I've got these amazing knights who've got so much vim and vigor, and they want to be doing something, but there are no dragons anymore, and there's no wars, so I can't. What do I do with them? And it was Guinevere, his wife, who said, well, look, the wars out there, those bloody wars have all been fought, but there are many, many wars right on our doorstep. The woman next door who's had her hen stolen, and the man next door whose crops have failed. These are all little wars, and they all need, or little wrongs, and people being petty and mean to each other in the villages, generally being unpleasant. She said, these are very valid wars that need to be addressed. You need the knights to be looking at these wars instead. And he said, well, how will I go about doing that? She said, we'll take the best knight and the worst knight and put them together and set them about finding problems to solve, little mini wars to solve. And the story is really about what happens when you achieve all your goals. Then what do? Then you have to find other ones, but maybe they're not as great as the big war. Maybe it's lots of little wars, and then maybe it's, when you finished your own personal achievement, you've got to the top of your journey, or you then what you do in retirement? Well, you go and do things for other people, and you fight little wars. I always loved that story. I thought it was a sweet little tale that we came across.
I do love that, and I love it because everybody wants to do the big heroic act, and that's so ego driven. And yet it's the small things of everyday life that really count and really matter on a day-to-day basis, and they require some humility. And here you have these knights who think that these things are beneath them. And they're having to realize, no, actually they're not. They're not.
No, they're very much part of, I think that's one of the things that most of the fairy stories and most of the myths keep on reminding us, that hubris, arrogance in the face of the gods, is the thing that brings us down. So it's usually, in the fairy stories, it's usually some act of unkindness that put somebody in, send somebody down. When you don't share your bread with a stranger, you don't rich, but when you do, you get a golden goose or strawberries in winter or something. When you've actually shared the little that you have, rather than saying, "Oh no, I don't have enough for myself." And these little sort of they're repeated so many times in myth, and then of course fairy tale comes out of myth. Really, it's the sort of the everyday version, but I think that just tells us so much about life. It's yes, you can become the richest and the famous, and you have all the money in the world, but without human companionship, love, bread and butter, it means nothing. And that's where Midas comes in, because of course we bring in the story of Midas and the golden touch. You remember when he touches everything and it turns to gold, and then his daughters turns to gold, and then you think, and his bread and butter turns to gold, and he thinks, actually, I think I've made a bit of a mistake here, because what's gold when you haven't got people, love, food, a soft bed to sleep on?
And there's something there also about turning everything into a commodity.
Exactly.
Looking at everything as a commodity. And when you do that, how lonely it must be, because you can't actually see the heart of anything. You're just looking at everything as a means to an end. One of the things I really value about the book is, as you say, the fact that it's been sectioned into the various phases of life. And I think, the beginning stories to do with parenthood and childhood, the parent-child relationship, are so powerful. Just looking at that as the stuff of my sessions with clients, and thinking, yeah, this is so absolutely right. And the very first one about Thetis and Achilles. Would you tell the story, please, Juliet?
Oh. Okay, so Thetis is married, the god of wisdom, is married to a mortal. Zeus has her married to a mortal because he's been told that if she lives, she'll be more powerful than him. So he wants her not to have any immortal children. So she gives birth to Achilles, who's obviously has a mortal father, and she wants him to be immortal because she wants him to have great glory. And so she tries to basically go against the will of the god, Zeus, another god. And so she dips it. She takes him to the river Styx because she can get in there because she's a goddess. And she tries to dip him in the waters of the river Styx, which confers immortality. But she holds him by his ankle, by the Achilles heel, this little tiny patch on the body, and she dips him in the water. But of course, her thumbprint covers up that little bit of humanity, and that then makes him vulnerable. So in the Trojan War, he actually gets shot in the Achilles heel, which is how he dies. But it's this feeling that from a psychological point of view, it's the parents wanting their children to be perfect, actually, to be immortal, to be shining in every way, to not to be just an ordinary human being. And that can put an enormous strain on a child, because actually you want to be loved for yourself, not because you're superhuman or perfect or, it's sort of like just you is good enough. And that's the thing that is actually missed when she was trying hard to get the most glory for Achilles. And of course, he was famously asked, I think he was asked whether he wanted a short life of glory or a long life of being insignificant, and he chose a short life of glory. So he died young in battle, but he died. And I think what keeps the thing that keeps on repeating in the book, in all the various different ones, is that at the end, all our attempts to cheat, old age, death, or sickness or boredom, ordinary things, all our attempts to try to circumvent those, all end at the same place.
And that is as true for the gods as it is for the humans in the stories, because she is a goddess,
but she still tries to.
Still, yeah, and I think you think about the Kronos trying to stop the prophecy that he was going to be overthrown by his children, and all of these things are very much about, when we're looking at this theme of not cheating fate, I think you can read it very much as the need to accept the limitations of life. We can rail against them as much as we like, but the limitations are the limitations, and we have to be creative and work within them. It's the parent who sometimes has to say no to the child. I mean, just today we were at a farm, and there was in a kind of chicken coop, there were some young roosters, I think born at Easter, so maybe a couple of months old. Actually, no, we had a late Easter, so they're even younger than that. And there's a sign that says that free to a good home. And there were some adolescent girls who had decided that they wanted to get a hold of them, and what they were doing was not very gentle or good. And also they didn't have parental consent, or but they just wanted these fluffy, cute things. And it had to be pointed out to them that free to a good home doesn't mean you could just take them. You can't just take them. Something that they then spent a long time brooding about the fact that this had been said to them. So, and I think that this is us as human beings. These adolescent girls were having to be told that there are limits. Yes, it says free to a good home, but that means that they have to go to a good home, which means that we have to show that you're going to take care of them and look after them. Their parents have to accept that they're going to come home, etc. This is us. That's it. That's us as human beings.
Yeah.
We want it all our way, and we spend fortunes of taxpayers' money devising technologies to cheat death, to do this, to do that. We have got to the point where we are fanatically regulating society for health and safety reasons, and
killing ourselves in the
process. So I think this is humanity, and all of these myths, are there to reminding us, okay, yes, it's not something that we want or we want to enjoy, but there are limits to what we can do. So how about we get creative and do the best within that? I think that's a very interesting approach to take.
I mean, I think on that front, the myth of Phaeton and the sun chariot is, it's so relevant, because Phaeton is the son of Apollo from a mortal woman, and he's teased by his school friends, and they say, no, we don't really believe you've got a famous father, and father isn't really the sun god and all that. And so he goes to his father and said, I'm having a really hard time at school, they're bullying me and they don't believe I'm of any importance, can I? And his father says, of course, no, I'll say, of course you're my son. And so he promises him anything by the river Styx, which is very an unbreakable promise. And then Phaeton says, okay, well, I'd like to take your um, sun chariot out for the day with the horses and do the rounds with. And then Apollo says, oh no, please, or Helios says, no, don't do it, don't do it. It's impossible. You won't be able to do it. You'll crash. It just won't happen. But he's absolutely insistent. And of course, he takes it and he scorches the earth and he freezes the earth and he causes some of the inconsistencies in the in the earth, too cold, too hot, deserts and all the rest of it. And then finally ends up falling out of the chariot to his death. And Apollo's very upset about it, but there's nothing he can do because he can't stop. The sun will not listen. And we sort of can see these things coming with children and young people, and not just children and young people. It can be anybody, really. Just overstepping the mark, refusing to accept the potential difficulties, and then coming unstuck, and it's awful. I don't know why this keeps happening. But I know what I have to do. I think I have to turn my WhatsApp off. Let me see if that will work. There, that's it. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's all right. Yes, I think on that front, there are also some non-tragic stories. My favorite being the one about Hera and Hephaestus. So let's share that one.
Yes. Oh, well, there are two actually. There's the one about Ares, and Hephaestus fighting over Aphrodite, and there's the other one about Hephaestus coming up from the underworld and making his mother a golden throne. Was that the one you were thinking of?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Hephaestus was the firstborn of Hera and Zeus, and he was born lame. He couldn't walk. He was quite deformed, and basically he didn't fit the Olympian vision. Hera was quite embarrassed that her first son, that she'd created a lot of fuss about, I'm having this child and Zeus and she made a big fuss about it, and then the child was not as good as she thought it was going to be. So she cast him down to the sea, where she was looked after by the water gods. But he was incredibly creative, and he made the most beautiful jewelry and ornaments and all sorts of things underwater, quite interestingly, with fire. But anyway, you can do that in myth. Anyway, he finally wanted to get hold of his mother, meet his mother. So he created this beautiful golden throne and sent it up to Olympus for Hera to sit on. And she was delighted. She said, oh, this is beautiful. And she sat down. And as soon as she sat down, manacles came across and grasped her arms and made her stick to the throne. She was chained, couldn't get out. And he said, until you accept me, until you have me up with you here on Olympus, until you live with me, let me live with you. I'm not going to release you. And so finally she had to accept it. And then she brought him up onto Olympus, and he became the god of the forge and was a very accepted and very much loved member of the Olympian crew. But he absolutely insisted on holding his mother to account. He would not be overlooked.
What I also really like is that he also became a peacemaker.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something here about, I'll tell you why I love it so much. She outright rejects him. In fact, she throws him out, and he falls into the sea. So this is not I think I'll give him up for adoption. It's an outright rejection. And he falls into the sea. The sea obviously is indicative of, deep sensitivity, emotionality, etc. And yes, he is very angry. And, he does refuse to release her or to actually go to Olympus at all.
Mm.
So he really plays a hardball game there initially. And he does have to be literally dragged back to Olympus. But why I love it so much is not just because there is a happy ending. It's because it is such a common story that the child who is rejected by the parent is the more empathic child, the more sensitive child. And I think that the moment when he comes in and says, no, you know what? There's a blood oath here, sort of, by virtue of the fact that you are my parent, you are my mother in this case. You cannot just turn away from me. And he stands up to her. And I think that that's so crucial, because when we fail to do that, when we fail to stand up to, then we are diminished and we are pretty much destroyed. But when we face up to that parent and we say, I am worth more than this, then something changes and the person comes into their own power. Doesn't always work that the parent accepts them. This is a happy ending. But it's still empowering. I think that's really important.
And I think that that Hephaestus is actually acknowledged by all the gods as being, the fact that he is not as beautiful, or that he can't walk as well, or whatever his problem. But his creativity is appreciated by all of them, and they all call to him for help with their various, swords or helmets, or he's a very helpful god. And they all appreciate him very much for his talent, not just not just sort of fighting in battles and so on. His skill, his talent, his creativity is appreciated by everybody, and they really admire him.
There is something very yin about his energy.
Yeah,
it's you think of him particularly with the link to the sea. There's something quite Piscean about his energy as well. The fact that he can forgive his mother. Well, there's something there that's very Piscean. It's so important. Let's fast forward then to the last phase. Which of the stories really pulls at you there?
Well, there is the story of the final story of Indra and the ants, the sort of the reincarnation story. But the one I really do like is Plato's The Myth of who goes into the underworld, the warrior who dies but isn't is allowed to go into the chambers of the underworld and see how the dead get reincarnated, basically, and watches the souls choosing their next life, because they're all sort of gathered together. They go from one area where they've been either living in Aleutian Isles and then they're going to get a new life, or they're in Tartarus, or somewhere a bit more unpleasant while they're sort of suffering from their previous lives. But they get the choice, and they're told, you know, you can have one of these lives, but be sure you look quite carefully at the lives that you're going to choose. And there's a guy, you know, like with a list of lives, and he says, okay, so there's the king, you know, very powerful king with lots of children, and some, I'll have that one. And then he looks into it much more carefully. He realizes that he's actually going to eat his children, and you know he's going to be one of the horrible. And he says, "No, it's not fair. I didn't mean it." But they said, "I'm sorry, you didn't look hard enough. You didn't choose carefully enough. You're stuck now. This is your life, so get on with it." And then all the souls choose their different lives. And Odysseus, he watches. So is watching all of this. The witness. He doesn't die. He goes back to life, but he's able to watch the choices in the halls of the dead. And he sees Odysseus, who's obviously been away from home for 20 years and had loads of adventures, but always trying to get home and never quite makes it. Looks very carefully, and then he finds this one little life that nobody else wanted, the life of a very simple shepherd. And he says, that's the one for me. I never want to go on a journey again. I've had enough of of being a hero and journeying. So I just want to stay home. I just want a very simple life. Thank you very much. And I thought that was a really lovely, you know, there's obviously lots of other stories, but then they're all told to go to spend the night by the river of forgetfulness, but to drink a little bit, not too deeply. But most of them drink very deeply, and they all forget their old lives. So they go into the new life and they have nothing to remember from their past lives. So, you know, and then they're all, obviously, then they're reborn, and the situation goes on and again. But I think it's a lovely story.
It is. And I think it's also, in some ways, reminiscent. Well, actually, it tallies. It's not reminiscent, but it tallies with the accounts we have of near-death experiences too, and also life between life regressions, where there is the opportunity to review one life, and there is the opportunity to choose the type of life that is going to be most meaningful for the growth of the soul. And the fact that most of us don't remember that, you know, I think there's just so much. When you consider from a historical perspective, we haven't been on this planet all that long. But these are ancient stories. But already they are so meaningful in terms of bringing pathos and understanding to the human experience. It's almost like what we as a species needed in order to grow and evolve was there a very long time ago. And we need to remember so that we can continue to progress and evolve and grow from a soul perspective rather than regress. And it feels lately that we are regressing. But I'm hoping that, as we therapists know, healing is not linear. And often regressing is indicative of a leap forward coming soon. So that's a hopeful way of looking at it.
Well, yes. And I think that in the end, if we keep remembering that actually the simple things in life are the ones that actually are the most meaningful, and that kindness, and it sounds a bit trite and a bit sort of, you know, yuck, but actually it's, in the end, that's actually what really matters. And I think actually thinking back to Midas, you know, he gets this gift, and he actually gets it because he does an act of kindness. Dionysus gives him the gift of gold because he looked after his old drunken, Dionysus's old drunken tutor. He got drunk at a party and misbehaved, and King Midas didn't scorn him. He actually just took him to a room and said, look, have a little lie down. You're making a bit of a fool of yourself. Let's just, he was actually, he was a king, but he was also very, very human and humane. And for that small act of kindness, Dionysus said, you can have any gift you want. And he said, oh, great. Everything I can touch turns to gold. Dionysus said, well, if you're really serious about it, go for it. And so he touches everything. And then, of course, when he's hungry, his bread turns to gold. And when he's thirsty, his wine turns to gold. And then he's upset and his daughter comes in and he says, like, oh, please come and give me a hug. And then she turns to gold. At which point he says, no, I don't want this gift anymore. And Dionysus is kind enough to say, okay, you can touch what you want and keep that, but then you can wash your hands in the river Pactolus, and then the gift will be washed away. And they say that the river Pactolus has golden sands even to this day.
What a beautiful way on which to end our conversation today.
Yes, so that gold is not the most important thing. Yes, it's lovely, and it's not the most important. And I think that's probably what a lot of these stories keep on reminding us again and again and again.
And so it is that I remind everyone watching this conversation of ours to pay attention to the myths behind the signs. Pay attention to the myths and the stories of the gods and goddesses of the planets, because therein lies the real gold of astrology in helping us all to better understand ourselves and the condition of humanity. And the book to help you to do this, of course, is called The Mythic Journey, The Meaning of Myth as a Guide to Life. And Juliet, I thank you, and Liz Greene, both for this delightful book and all of the wisdom within it, and for your time today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. It's been lovely talking to you. Thanks, Anne.
And thank you all for watching. Now, I'll be putting a link to the book in the description box, as well as the Center for Psychological Astrology, so that you can find Juliet there as well, and a link to my own websites and my Substack. Next time, we'll be looking at Jupiter in Cancer, as well as Manwë. Until then, goodbye.